Hello, welcome to our special program, Russian Roulette. I'm Stan Grant. Ukraine could be just hours away from invasion. That's according to US intelligence agencies. The United States is hoping for a diplomatic solution to the Ukrainian crisis, but the situation is fraught. President Putin is drawing battle lines in what's already been called a new Cold War. Russia continues to deny plans to invade, but has amassed 130,000 troops on the border, and mobilisation does have momentum. Now, the Kremlin is already claiming some sort of a victory without yet firing a shot, winning the psychological war by weakening the neighbouring state that Putin covets and forcing the international community to hang on his every word. Now, coming up, we have correspondents in Ukraine and Washington. We examine the looming military campaign, the global economic impact and the fears for international aid agencies. Let's go first, though, to Kyiv and speak to James Waterhouse, the BBC's correspondent. James, good of you to be with us. We've been hearing some reports just in the last hour that there may be some movement of troops on the border, some Russian troops returning to barracks. What are you hearing?
That's right. It's the first sign of de-escalation that we've seen from Russia. The country's defence ministry in the last half an hour has announced that some troops are going to be pulling back from military drills on the border. They've released pictures of tanks moving across the country. What we don't know is how many troops that is, and also whether this is either a meaningful de-escalation or just a show of theatre. So we don't really know on that front. Olaf Scholz, Germany's Chancellor, is in Moscow today for a continuation of talks. So it could be a significant development. We'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, and it does indicate some movement, given that we've seen this increasing troop build-up and military exercises around the region in recent weeks. But what are the calculations, if you like, that Vladimir Putin might be making right now?
That really depends on who you ask. The West are getting very twitchy about the whole situation. As you mentioned earlier, you've got 130,000 estimated Russian troops forming a pincer movement around Ukraine. That includes naval drills to the south in the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. Ukraine has accused the Navy of effectively forming a blockade on its ports. And then you've got these ongoing military exercises in Belarus to the north, Russia's ally. That country shares a 700-mile border with Ukraine and is just a 3-hour drive from here in Kyiv. So that the border has been tense for a while and has only been getting more tense, although today's pulling back of troops will be seen as a positive sign. President Zelensky of Ukraine has announced tomorrow as a day of unity. Why? Well, the West has pinpointed Wednesday as a potential day for invasion, saying it's imminent. He in turn has announced a day of unity. Some political commentators have described that as the right tone to strike, to stand up to this ongoing Russian aggression. Others have described it as political schizophrenia, saying you're telling us to stay calm, but equally to go out and start waving flags and to start generating all this excitement. So it is a tense week. It is hard to ignore for Ukrainians, this continuing building up of troops, as well as the news reports and speculation and world leaders giving their 2 pence worth on, what is going to happen next.
Yeah, James, I wanted to get your sense of how people are bearing up under this, because we were talking about people who've experienced conflict or the threat of conflict now since 2014. Volodymyr Zelensky was trying to play down the level of threat, but what are people telling you on the ground?
Well, people have been telling me that they're frustrated a lot of the time because you've got this mixed messaging. You've got a tale of two narratives where you've got the West saying it's serious. They're evacuating their embassies. At least 5 countries have done that. More than a dozen countries have told their citizens to leave the country. And Ukrainians are thinking, well, hang on, if that's happening and President Zelensky's government are telling us to stay calm, who is right here? There has been a narrowing of that gap. We've heard ministers here say they have seen intelligence demonstrating a building up of troops. But what Ukrainians want is a simple de-escalation. They want Russia to pull back, and you're exactly right. For 8 years, a war has already been happening. 2 Ukrainian soldiers were injured just last night in the eastern occupied territories in the Donbass by Russian-backed militants. So the fighting goes on. More than 14,000 Ukrainians have lost their lives. Crimea was, of course, annexed as well. So when you've got this ongoing Russian aggression, and then it also includes cyber attacks and misinformation campaigns, as Russia continues to use Ukraine as this battleground to let NATO and the West know what it thinks about expansion and what Vladimir Putin sees as his own personal connection, as well as Russia's connection as he sees it with Ukraine, Ukraine just bears the brunt of it. So it's very simple for Ukrainians. They're used to it, but they would just like to see things de-escalate themselves.
James, thank you. James Waterhouse, the BBC's correspondent, live for us in Kyiv. Now we're going to go to Washington and get the view from there with ABC correspondent Jade McMillan.
The United States has been warning for some time now that a Russian invasion of Ukraine could be imminent, but officials here have really ramped up that rhetoric over the past few days, arguing that, in their view, Russian President Vladimir Putin is now fully prepared to launch an attack if he chooses to do so. They say that the number of troops gathered near the Ukrainian border and also in Belarus continue to grow, and that an invasion could happen within days, potentially before the Winter Olympics end on February 20th. There has been some optimism expressed here in Washington today to these signs from Russia that it is willing to continue to talk, that these diplomatic rounds that have been ongoing will or could continue. If there is an invasion, though, the US has been warning of swift and unprecedented economic consequences in the form of sanctions, vowing to go further than what it did back in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. The US President Joe Biden has even declared that if an attack occurs, he will stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from going ahead, that project that would deliver massive amounts of Russian gas into Germany. He says that he would stop that, although he hasn't really explained how that would work. In the meantime, the US has sent nearly 5,000 troops into Poland to try to reassure NATO allies. That's on top of around 8,500 troops that have been placed on heightened alert in case they are needed to deploy at short notice as part of a NATO response force. Those troops in Poland will receive a visit from Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin this week. That was announced today as part of a broader European visit that he is making, as Western leaders emphasise the need for a coordinated response if Russia does attack.
Well, all is most certainly not quiet on the Eastern Front, and Russia is looking to re-establish its sphere of influence. Let's take a look at how we got here.
Ukraine sits at a strategically important location, the crossroads of Europe, Asia and the Black Sea. Its geographic position between Russia and the West also describes its political and economic footing. The two countries share a mostly common alphabet, a 2,200-kilometre land border, and a vital network of gas pipelines. But that's not all. They also have a tumultuous 1,000-year-long history.
Ever since the end of World War II, Russia has defined its security as requiring buffer states between it and the West.
In 2013, then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych chose not to sign the European Union Association Agreement, which would have strengthened economic ties to the West. This was a move clearly seen to be pro-Russian. It sparked massive protests on the streets of Kyiv. By the beginning of 2014, the clashes with police turned deadly. Russia took advantage of the chaos to send troops across the border into Crimea. Under occupation by Russian forces, the Crimean parliament held an emergency session where a vote was held to dissolve the regional government and a date set for a referendum offering a move to annexation by Russia. A month later, the referendum was held and swung overwhelmingly towards accepting Russian control.
Since the Russian intervention, we've been mobilizing the international community to condemn this violation of international law and to support the people and government of Ukraine.
While President Putin claims it fully consistent with international law and the UN Charter. A month later, pro-Russian militias seized the cities of Luhansk and Donetsk and declared them independent from Ukraine. The Ukrainian army moved to take the cities back, but Russian forces covertly backed the separatist groups, which led to fierce fighting across the Donbas region. In July 2014, the passenger airliner MH17 was shot down while flying over eastern Ukraine. All 283 passengers and 15 crew were killed, including 38 Australian citizens. While Russia has denied any involvement in the attack, forensic evidence points to Russian weaponry operating in an area under separatist control.
There is not any proof there. All the facts presented there mean nothing.
Ultimately, 4 men were charged, 3 Russians and 1 Ukrainian, who since gained Russian citizenship. None have been extradited to face charges. The incident led to further international condemnation, and in 2015, the Minsk II agreement was struck to end hostilities. But the agreement didn't last, and there are almost daily violations of the ceasefire along the contact line. As many as 1.5 million people have been displaced by the conflict, and there are estimates of 15,000 lives lost. So far, the US has poured more than $2.5 billion in security assistance to the country since 2014. Under the Trump government, US funding was tied to investigations of his political rivals, undermining many years of US advocacy for systemic reform in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics continue to claim control over the area. They've morphed from militias into political parties who ran largely unchallenged elections in 2018. They're backed by Russia, who've deployed a combination of disinformation tactics, covert fighters, as well as regular Russian troops and conventional military support to uphold the separatists in the Donbas region. Russia's involvement has drawn economic sanctions from the West. At great cost, Russia has attempted to circumvent Ukraine by building the massive Nord Stream 2 pipeline that takes Russian gas directly to Germany via the Baltic seabed. But economic sanctions threatened by the G7 could put this investment in peril.
The fact is that gas is not currently flowing through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. If Vladimir Putin wants to see gas flow through that pipeline, he may not want to take the risk of invading Ukraine.
At the same time, the Ukrainian government's move towards aligning with NATO has further strained the relationship with Russia. Putin announced red lines if Ukraine is allowed to become a member state. Despite assurances from Moscow, satellite imagery showed Russian forces gathering at sites near the border. They appear to show a build-up of up to 100,000 troops, as well as tanks, artillery, and even short-range ballistic missiles, all within striking distance of Ukraine's border. And while the tactic was successful in drawing the US back to the table for bilateral talks, it's a dangerous gambit on a scale not seen since the height of the Cold War.
Let's discuss this further with our panel now. Dr. Gorana Grgic is a senior lecturer, government and international relations at the United States Studies Centre. Dr. Leonard Petrov is a political and business expert at the ANU and the International College of Management, Sydney. And Dr. Olga Olenikova is a senior lecturer of social and political sciences at UTS. Nice to have all of you with us. Leonard, can I start with you first of all and just bring that news that we've been hearing in the past week, the past hour rather. There may be some movement of Russian troops being pulled back after they've carried out their exercises. Perhaps that's an indication of de-escalation. How would you read this?
Well, we should not forget that Russia is in the middle of the major military drills. The Allied resolve, together with the government of Belarus, the troops have been moved from central Russia, from eastern Russia, towards closer to the western borders, including the territory of the Belarus. So if troops now moving northward or southward, well, I don't think it really matters. But as long as the drills, this military exercise is going on, it's pretty natural as long as they're not moving westward.
So that doesn't necessarily indicate a de-escalation to you? There may be a window here. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there is always window for diplomacy, and President Putin has been indicating for months, particularly after the summit with Joe Biden in Europe. We saw that diplomacy has been simply defaulting on any resolving and any bringing any fruit. So potentially there still always be a possibility to discuss and find a solution to something. The problem is what is on the table. And it looks like Russia is not doing anything reckless so far, but nervousness is being instigated by the West. And of course, Belarus is very fidgety about the potential aggression. And that's why Ukraine is also amassing troops in its eastern borders. So that's the problem.
Olga, the United States has been warning that potentially by Wednesday there could be some form of invasion here. There's certainly a lot of troops on the border, and Vladimir Putin has shown in the past, whether it be Georgia or whether it be Ukraine previously, that he is prepared to use them. In the mixture of diplomacy and deterrence, where do you put most weight right now? The diplomatic option, or is it still possible to deter him?
Well,
I think one of the most important latest news is that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, right, had actually delivered an interesting news on his press conference, where he said that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has promised to put forward a draft law of special status of Donbass. And it's just happening now. So I'm pretty sure, that's a sign that diplomacy is winning at this stage. And I think we'll see more of actually more actions from the Ukrainian side on the Minsk agreements implementation in the coming days. So I feel like that's a really good sign that peaceful conflict resolution is possible. And I doubt, that Russia will actually, will try to do a physical, invasion into Ukraine in the coming days. And I hope really for peaceful conflict resolution. And I see the signs of it happening, especially in the last couple of days.
Gorana, are you that optimistic? Do you believe that the diplomacy may be winning, as Olga said there? And what does winning look like? Does Vladimir Putin still get to achieve some of the security guarantees that he set out initially in any event?
I think, as everyone, I am hopeful that there will be some sort of diplomatic rabbit out of the head pulled. And again, similar to the co-panelists here, I do think that it's a good thing that conversations keep on going, and we are getting these nuggets now from different press conferences and press releases. For instance, the one that Vladimir Putin had with his foreign minister Lavrov, where there was also some sort of nugget that the diplomacy keeps on going. And so obviously there the worry is obviously there, given the troop buildup and the potential for any sort of incident that could actually escalate. But at the same time, it's good that they keep on talking. Now, in terms of what winning looks like, we have to understand that obviously everything that Vladimir Putin has been doing was to actually effect some sort of concessions from the West more broadly, U.S. in particular. The U.S. has signaled so far that it's willing to put on the table certain issues that have been a peeve in the U.S.-Russia relations, whether it's something to do with the INF Treaty, arms control, and similar. But also we have to understand that there are on both sides certain red lines. So what I don't think Vladimir Putin is going to get is some sort of, written promise of NATO's open door policy ending or something along those lines. And equally, where the West obviously won't be going is around some of those issues of sovereignty of countries, right, and inviolability of borders. But when it comes to the issues that have been propelling the conflict, and obviously Russia's interest in east of Ukraine. Similar to the previous speaker, obviously the Minsk agreement is something now that is being discussed more closely. So various forms of power sharing down the line, status of Crimea and similar.
Leonard, I'll come back to you in just a moment, but I want to go back to Olga and continue this discussion around the Minsk agreement and what the big picture is here. Because regardless of what happens immediately with Ukraine, we know that this conflict has already been going for 8 years. Thousands of people have died, tens of thousands have been displaced. And there is still, from Vladimir Putin, Olga, this idea that he wants to change the security arrangements post-World War II in Europe. He wants to increase Russia's sphere of influence. He wants security guarantees. He's prepared to use force or threaten force to achieve them. So that still stays on the table, doesn't it? What does an ultimate resolution look like here without acquiescing to intimidation or force?
Yeah, that's a very hard question, right? So what is the best resolution? I think no one can, have a very clear response to that at this stage. Definitely Ukraine is located, right, in such a geographical position where we are sharing borders with ex-imperial state, right? So we always have to deal with the imperialistic, ambitions of Russia, quite aggressive policies and their interest, right, in Eastern Europe, right? So we fall under their exact sphere of influence and interest. So definitely, even if the Minsk agreements go ahead, we'll find the common ground. So Ukraine finds the common ground with Russia, and Donbass and Luhansk territories return back, hopefully, or become independent within the Ukrainian nation state. That can be a good trigger to try to postpone, right, any physical withstanding with Russia. If you look into the modern, right, achievements of modern world, that we didn't have, Third World War is achievement, right, of our actually humanity at this stage. So it will be pretty horrible situation if actually Russia, and it will be shock situation, I would say, for everyone, if Russia physically invades, right? There's many other options how Russia can control Ukraine and how Russia keeps the influence in Ukraine and the region. Russia doesn't have to occupy, right? The big physical occupation is not necessary at this stage. What they can do to control Ukraine and what they already are doing for the last 8 years, they are creating, the impacting economic situation in Ukraine. They are there's a range of cyber attacks, which the world has heard about that in the last as well couple of weeks, where the Ukrainian government sites were under cyber attacks. And there's many other options, damage to infrastructure within the cybersphere as well. There's many other options how to control Ukraine and how to maintain this sphere of influence in the region, instead of actually going for physical invasion and occupying physically the main cities of Ukraine.
Leonard, we're talking about this, and it's almost as if there is some level of acceptance that a greater Russian influence in Ukraine may be an acceptable outcome here. There's already been some discussion on the Ukrainian side about potentially pulling back from the idea of eventually at some point joining NATO. Can you, Leonard, take us into the Vladimir Putin worldview, how he sees Ukraine, why he believes that is a part of Greater Russia, what he fears from NATO expansion, and is his claims of a humiliation of Russia post-Cold War, do those claims have some validity?
Well, good question. And I think everyone would agree that President Putin simply wants to stay in power indefinitely. He's prepared to do everything for that, changing a constitution, annexing territories, going into confrontation with a nuclear power. Everything is the grease for the mill. And so I believe that President Putin is also looking at Ukraine as simply as a function of his policies, a predominantly domestic one. Ukraine in the last, particularly last 8 years, turned into an alternative to an authoritarian dictatorship, which Russia turned into. And prominent Russian opposition leaders and people like journalists, they all migrate to Ukraine, particularly after Belarus demonstrated its iron fist in suppressing democracy and freedom of speech. So for President Putin, it's important simply to create chaos in Ukraine and to demonstrate that this alternative path of development is simply not feasible. Another dream of President Putin is to gain respect from his Western counterparts, and creating a crisis and inviting them into negotiating table is something what he learned from Kim Jong-un's logbook. So he's not prepared for a major military campaign. Yes, he flexes the muscle, he brings the troops back and forward, he tries to compel the Western and Ukrainian counterparts to stick to the Minsk agreements, which are simply not palatable. And very hardly, it's very difficult to imagine that Ukraine will go along that path, which was, again, engineered by Vladimir Putin 8 years ago on the verge of Ukrainian military collapse. But things have changed. Ukraine has gained the military might, and also it got respect from Western powers. And I think that President Putin is simply trying to continue that story in order to perpetually keeping the crisis and perpetually staying in power and demonstrating his own electorate that he is the great leader who is the only one who can decide peace or war in Europe.
Gorana, we've been talking about Putin, about Russia and what Russia may do. Let's flip that. You're in Europe, you've been doing work with NATO. Give us an understanding of where NATO sits, where the US sits, the capacity to respond to this type of intimidation or even aggression or perhaps even invasion right now, in this tussle of authoritarianism and democracy that we're seeing increasingly in the world today. How robust is the NATO alliance? How strong still is the United States in being able to push back against that?
Yes, so the question of transatlantic unity is one that has been obviously on the minds of many analysts and commentators over the past couple of months. I think where we have basic and kind of baseline agreement is that Russia, if it does launch an incursion into Ukraine, will face severe penalties for that. Where we then start having differences is probably the extent to which those consequences or their magnitude are going to be. But what's clear is that I think that both on the US side and the European side, no one is talking about sending troops necessarily into Ukraine. But we are talking about severe sanctions on all aspects of Russia's economy. And then obviously what we have seen over the past couple of months as well, the provision of lethal armament, as well as troop deployment and ramp up deployment of troops around NATO's eastern flank. Okay. Now, I think when it comes to, the key players, we are seeing a different sort of approach. So certainly President Biden in some of his statements has made it very clear that the United States is ready to obviously coordinate with allies in terms of these sanctions. But there were some slip-ups as well in terms of the extent to which, Vladimir Putin acts, what sort of responses might he face, right? So just showing maybe even that kind of opening again in terms of the negotiations with Moscow. But we, on the European side, I think it has been interesting just to observe over the past couple of weeks. Even, we've had French President Macron going to Russia, who is definitely, one of the European leaders who's talking more about Europeans taking their own defense and security into their own hands, to Olaf Scholz, German Chancellor, who is currently in Moscow today after being in Kyiv yesterday, who is maybe more reluctant and maybe, more worried about the economic repercussions, to all the way to UK and, Prime Minister Johnson, who has been very ready to send armament to Ukraine, much more so than, say, some other of the leading European nations, especially, contrasted with Germany.
Gorana, thank you. Gorana Gurgic there. Olga Olenikova, thank you so much for your input as well, and Dr. Leonid Petrov. Now, Russia's military deployment is the biggest since the Cold War. From submarines and ballistic missiles to tanks and fighter jets, Ukraine is surrounded on three sides.
US officials say Russia has assembled at least 70% of the military firepower needed to give President Vladimir Putin the option of launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Some of the Russian units deployed near the country's border have travelled more than 6,000 kilometres to prepare for action. Even just a few weeks ago, deployments of firepower and military personnel have all but hemmed in Ukraine. Battalion tactical groups numbering 800 soldiers each are deployed across Ukraine's northern and eastern borders on the Crimean Peninsula, as well as in Transnistria, a part of Russian-occupied Moldova. Additionally, artillery, armoured vehicles and tanks nearly encircle the country. Moscow also has thousands of troops carrying out joint military exercises in Belarus. Overall, Russia possesses around 1 million active duty personnel, the fifth largest in the world, with another 2 million troops in reserve. Alone, Ukraine wouldn't stand a chance. President Volodymyr Zelensky has signed a decree to add an extra 100,000 troops to its military ranks, taking the total to around 360,000. It's also outgunned. Russia's 2,840 battle tanks outnumber its southern neighbour 3-1. It's for this reason that NATO is expanding its presence in Eastern Europe. The 30-country-strong military alliance has multinational battle groups stationed in the Baltic states, as well as Poland and Romania. While the bloc has nearly 3.5 million troops and civilian personnel combined, it's the NATO Response Force, or NRF, that'll come into play should its standoff with Russia escalate. It's a contingent of 40,000 soldiers, sailors and airmen ready to mobilise in a crisis. When the US announced it was putting 8,500 troops on heightened alert to deploy to Europe, it was referring to supporting the NRF. The tip of the NRF spear is the 20,000 troops known as the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, or VJTF. It includes a multinational 5,000-strong land brigade, which are able to deploy within a 48-hour window. France leads the VJTF this year, taking the reins from Turkey. Next year, it'll be Germany's turn. Returning to the bigger picture, there is no plan to send NATO forces into Ukraine in the event of a Russian attack. The alliance is, however, responding to the elevated threat by bolstering its eastern and southeastern flank in Poland and Romania.
Jim Townsend was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO during the Obama administration. He's now a Senior Fellow in the Centre for a New American Security's Transatlantic Security Program. I spoke with him earlier and began by asking him what he thinks Vladimir Putin is considering right now.
Based on what I've been hearing and seeing to date, I think he's doing a final cost-benefit analysis. I think he is ready to go. I think he's got a range of options in terms of the military side. I think he knows also that if he wanted to go on a diplomatic side, he could, but the day is pretty late for doing that. If he were suddenly to say, okay, well, we'll have a big table and sit around the table and redo European security, I think it's kind of late for that. And he would be seen as losing. He'd be seen as capitulating to the West. So I think he is right now, he might be doing a final look at options, but I think they're all military. I don't think they are, maybe I should call Biden and see if we could sit down again. I think it's too late for that.
Now, we do know in the past with Georgia or Ukraine or interventions elsewhere like Syria that President Putin is willing to take the military option. And that does raise the stakes, doesn't it, for the West? So what does the US, NATO do in that event?
We've got to show a military side to this as well. Not that we're going to fight Putin in Ukraine, but in terms of NATO and in terms of the allies, we're going to really have to have forces go into those countries and remain there to make sure that that in terms of Putin casting his eyes around and looking for other targets, they're not going to be allies. We're going to protect those allies. And then the final point is that as an alliance for the United States, for NATO, we've got to now come to grips with an aggressive totalitarian in Russia. This isn't going to change. This is something that is going to spoil the view of a Europe whole, free and at peace, post-Cold War stability, and that's gone now. We're going to have to come up with a new approach to deal with a Russia on the march, on the one hand, and also deal with China in the Indo-Pacific. For the United States particularly, this is going to be tough for us. We're going to have to be able to do both.
Jim, all of this, of course, means an enormous human cost. Are we talking about something worse now than what we saw in 2014?
He's got the kind of capability to shock Ukraine in the opening hours of an assault. It doesn't necessarily have to look like World War II with tanks steaming across the borders and this type of thing. He can do that if he wants. He's got those there. But he can also use his air and he can use his missile capability, cyber attack. He can do a lot of things that will stun the nation, cause Zelensky to fall, and then he puts in his own people, and that's it. It could be just the kind of shock that shakes that nation up and doesn't involve an occupation and fending off an insurgency and fighting the Ukraine military. It could be something that could be very rapid and quick and brutal.
Now, if Russia does invade, the price of petrol will soar. Sarah Hunter is a senior economist at KPMG, and she joins us now. I want to go to you first of all, Sarah, and say, what will the impact of this be on global markets, given, of course, the big energy exporter that Russia is?
Yeah, well, if we did see an escalation in tensions, then certainly we'd expect to see a bit of a correction down in stock markets. In fact, we've already seen that starting to play through. The US markets fell on Friday after the US authorities made their sort of warning that military action could be imminent. And we saw the markets in Europe as well on Monday also downward correct by around about 2%, a bit less in some markets, a bit more in others. So clearly another step down if we saw a further escalation is likely in terms of stock markets.
Sarah, remind us again of Russia's position as an energy exporter and its importance to other parts of Europe, like countries like Germany, and how much of a bargaining chip that is for Vladimir Putin.
Well, it is a very important supply of natural gas in particular, and we've already, outside of the tensions with Ukraine, seen how a limited recovery in the supply of natural gas from Russia post-COVID has actually created some tensions and problems in gas markets there, with prices rising very sharply towards the end of last year. So we had low inventory levels and a much faster recovery in demand than supply through that market. Russia accounts for 35 to 40% of natural gas that's consumed in Europe, so it is clearly a key supplier, and that has been a concern certainly for the authorities, and we know, and we've had reports from the governments there, that they've been looking at alternative supplies should tensions escalate further, and there is a risk that those supplies don't come through as needed.
Sarah, in terms of deterrent, Joe Biden has said that Russia will face swift and severe retaliation for any invasion, and by that he means primarily sanctions. What impact would sanctions indeed have? We saw them imposed after the annexation of Crimea. It wiped about 1% or so off Russian GDP. But is that something that Vladimir Putin has calculated and can absorb?
Well, I mean, obviously, in terms of what the Russian economy can absorb and what is acceptable is a political question for Putin and others in the Russian government. But in terms of what's likely to be considered and imposed if things do deteriorate, it is typically going to be more of what we've seen in the past. So some financial sanctions are very likely. So this would be restrictions on what EU, US and other countries' citizens can do and operate in terms of Russian banks and what those Russian banks can do in terms of accessing capital markets in those countries. So, and that would significantly disrupt the operation of those financial institutions. We could also see some further restrictions on trade. So, as you mentioned, following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, there were restrictions placed on importing certain products that the Russian economy produces, but also exporting capital goods and equipment, particularly in the oil and gas sector. And finally, they were also put in place some very targeted specific restrictions around travel and financial dealings for certain Russian individuals. So all of those things could be expanded on and would further compound the negative drag that was created in 2014.
Sarah, just quickly, we've got under a minute, but how much foreign reserve strength does Vladimir Putin has? He's amassed quite a bit, hasn't he? It's one of the highest in the world. Is that a big enough buffer for him?
Well, that remains to be seen, and whether or not it is enough is a question of the severity of the restrictions, how long they last for, and the other fallouts and other economic plays in all of this. So we have at the moment very high oil prices as well as natural gas prices. This is generating a lot of revenue for the Russian economy. So in terms of outside factors, there are some supporting flows coming through. So it really does depend on how far sanctions might go if there is an escalation. And what the Russian economy and the Russian government are willing to accept.
Sarah Hunter from KPMG, thank you again.
Thank you.
Now, Murat Sahian is UNICEF's representative in Ukraine. I spoke with him a short time ago and I wanted to get a sense from him about what aid agencies need the international community to do right now.
Our humanitarian appeal for 2022 in December was about $15 million. As of now, what we soft commitments are around $3 million. So the forgotten crisis in the East, which means, hospitals need water, schools need, roof leaking, cold. So there are many challenges that is underfunded. Our humanitarian appeal, $15 million, only $3 million soft commitments. On top of it, the potential escalation that we are talking and hearing every day, it is not adding any additional resources to expand our programmatic and humanitarian outreach. So I appreciate the opportunity that you give to us to be the voices of children. Children need health, education, protection, psychosocial well-being support. We have the know-how, we have the team on the ground, but the financial commitments are very little from the international community. It's much more focused on the conflict. But we need, like you, in bringing the attention that, there are so many humanitarian partners on the ground also. They need financial support now, and the right time is now.
Murat, this conflict, as we know, has been going on for 8 years now. Does it feel different there on the ground? Is there a greater sense of fear or anticipation?
I have been 23 years with UNICEF, and I work in multiple emergency settings, including the Tajikistan, North Korea, to Kosovo, to multiple duty stations that I was deployed for emergency response. The organization is well capacitated in having human resources as well as know-how. It is different for people who are living on the ground, because every minute, every hour, when you turn on the social media networks, when you turn on to televisions and others, it's like tomorrow something is going to happen. But it builds on more stress to families, more stress to children, more stress to teachers. In one of my recent visits to a school in eastern Ukraine, we entered the school, we were having discussions with children and the teachers. At the same time, some shelling started. So you should see the chaos in the school that, families are calling their children to say, stay there, children running to a shelter, teacher calling the home and saying, hey kids, stay at your home, I'm in the school. So you can see the chaos that people live. This has been 8 years they were living, but it is now much more uncertainty, puts additional pressure and stress for parents as well as children. And at these times, humanitarian presence on the ground is important. That's why UNICEF is keeping its operation as much possible on the ground. And that's why our 4 field offices are fully operational, our team is on the ground, and then we keep on delivering.
Murat Sahin there from UNICEF. Before we go, just a reminder of the news that I've been bringing to you over the past hour now, and that is there are reports of some movement of Russian troops pulling back after military exercises, perhaps an indication of some diplomacy working and maybe a de-escalation. We'll continue to monitor that on ABC News. That's our program for now. I'm Stan Grant. We'll see you next time.